Yesterday, I talked about ravens, and I mentioned during that talk that when you're focusing on ravens, it's really just focusing on one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot to understanding sage-grouse populations, and wildfire and reshaping sagebrush communities with invasive grasses, state transition, and so forth, is another major component. So today, the title of my talk is Wildfire, Cheatgrass, and Drought, Oh My, Insights from Research on Greater Sage-Grouse. And I want to point out behind this, there's a massive collaboration. Cam Aldridge and his lab is involved in a lot of this work. All of the states have provided their data for a large portion of this work. And you can see the logos up on top. And I want to also point out that a few graduate students, Ian Dudley, Emily Tyrell, finished their theses on a lot of this work. And then Ian Dwight, who is working on his PhD, I'm going to be presenting some of his preliminary findings as well. So I get to be the voice for a lot of ongoing work from a large collaboration that I'm really proud of being part of. Okay, just to start out, I like to start out with just a data slide, just to kind of show basically what's happening. These are sage-grouse lek counts on average, range-wide with credible limits. And you can see here, when you look at this, some folks might say, okay, there's no real trend there. And others say, well, there's a lot of variation, interannual variation. But there is some really interesting patterns here. For example, with the exception of one period, every 9 to 11 years, we have this low point in the population. And that low point seems to get lower and lower every year. And we have a cycling type of behavior, periodicity here, where we have these about 9 to 11 year periods. And we know from research that we've conducted, specifically in the bi-state, but now range-wide, that this stochasticity is largely driven by precipitation, temperature as well, but climatic conditions. And you can see the remarkable trend here between precipitation. This is a 1 year lag effect on one axis, and regional trend on the other axis. That means that precipitation in 1 year influences population growth rate the following year. This functions at very large spatial scales. It's been great for us to understand this because when we think about population ecology and how populations function, this is actually a really good behavior for these populations to have this type of stochasticity. It means that they're tracking precipitation patterns, the populations are, and it could amount to neutral growth. We think of this as not a stable population, but oscillating around some carrying capacity. And listening to Kathy's talk yesterday, this might be what was said at some point as to a target of where we want birds to be from oscillations that have occurred in the past. Now, the difficulty is we have these stochastic factors like climatic condition that act on these populations in a very typical way, causing this stochastic behavior. But we also have deterministic factors like loss of habitat that reduce the carrying capacity through time. And if you remember the slides yesterday, and I talked about ravens and anthropogenic subsidies for ravens, that would actually be an increase in the carrying capacity through time, leading to that exponential growth. Well, we have something different here with sage-grouse, and that the carrying capacity is being reduced as habitat is being lost through these deterministic factors. And now I'm going to show some data on how some of those cartoon graphics and that conceptual model has been parameterized here. First of all, we took all the data from across the states and developed a state space and a Bayesian framework, a state space model to understand intrinsic growth rate. And this is basically just allows us to account for imperfect detection. Now we're interested in trends across different spatial scales. So we go all the way down to the lek level so we could get a trend at the lek, but we're more interested at closed populations or a metapopulation because we know birds move between these leks. So in collaboration with Cam Aldridge's lab, we've developed neighborhood clusters which represent those populations across the range. And then at the much larger spatial scale, we have these broader clusters that actually track those climatic conditions the best, in which we modeled the climatic conditions in those trends and had the best fit for these climate clusters. Overall, and this is all the data compiled across the range, we've found a figure or a trend that looks something like this. And you can see how it kind of depicts that cartoon graphic. We have the stochastic behavior, but we have a oscillating downward trajectory in populations. But when we think about where we make our inferences from, going back to the population low points, we call these naders, we get the most reliable trend estimates, because if you start on a high point like an apex and end on a nadir, you're going to overestimate the decline, or start on a nadir and end on an apex, you'll underestimate it. So this here gives you the most unbiased estimation. And you can see how remarkable, when we go back to these nadirs, how remarkable those trends are in their consistency. Overall, we have 3% declines. That adds up to quite a bit, about 80.7% across 53 years. Now, when we look at the spatiotemporal patterns of this, and the left figure is going to show the changes through time, the right figure is going to show how the population trends are at the different nadir points, you'll see that back through time, most of the declines, which are depicted in red, took place in the eastern portion of the range, which aligns with oil and gas development, cropland conversion. But as we move into these more recent time frames, we're seeing a lot of those declines at the population levels start to take place in the western portion of the range. And the most recent one here, we could see a very different difference in the range there. We really have, in this case, the tale of two ranges for the most recent declines, where we're seeing some increases, that's depicted in the blue, in the eastern portion of the range, and a lot of decline happening in the western portion of the range. And you can see also in Utah and Colorado those declines as well. Now, if you look at this, there's a lot of reasons for this. There's many cumulative effects that are taking place in the West, but the most important one is wildfire. And we know wildfire kills sagebrush, kills nearly all species of sagebrush, and it needs to regerminate from seed. And the problem here, as most of you are aware of, is when you have cheatgrass invading the system, or some seed base of cheatgrass and wildfire move through, you have this fire-prone, non-native annual grass that can invade these systems in the inner space. And this grass provides fuels for additional fires. So we get more frequency of fires, larger fires. It increases the continuity of fuel between shrubs, so you lose more shrub over time, and eventually transition from a dominated shrub state community to a annual grassland community, as we see on the right. And you could think of this now as something analogous to having gasoline on the landscape about midsummer, because it's dry, it's an annual grass, and can be pretty problematic when it comes to burning again. Now, we know this state transition from shrubland to grassland varies across ecological gradient. In warmer, drier conditions, it's more prone than cold, moist conditions. And we've have some products out there that have helped us understand where this takes place as far as R&R resilience and resistance. We've heard these concepts yesterday. So we use some of these products in our models that I'm going to talk about coming up here. So my topics are, we developed a net sagebrush loss model from wildfire so that we could look at chronic impacts on sage-grouse populations, not just the acute effect of wildfire, but the influence that wildfire has on habitat. Once we understand something about those patterns, I'm going to talk about the processes, the demographic rates that were influenced because of those fires. And then I'll talk about management action. So focusing first on this net sagebrush loss model. I'm not going to get into the weeds here too much, but we brought in a lot of fire perimeter data from one of the most comprehensive and reliable fire data sets that are out there right now that's recently published. And we're using the potential biophysical settings, not the classified, but the potential biophysical settings for land fire. These are the most reliable in understanding what should occur in that under that condition. And then we have resilience and resistance. And so for every fire that burns, we pixel by pixel on a 30-meter scale calculate recovery of that. And based on the resilience and resistance, it'll either move to a state transition, or it will recover to its original vegetation through time. And with every new fire, that resets. It's about as far into depth as I'm going to go on that. There's a lot more involved in that. There's a lot of processes that happen, but this is the outputs here. You can see on the left side through time, the by R&R, which is depicted in the different colors, the net sagebrush loss and recovery. We have it in a state of recovery or loss. And then what that looks like as far as the amount by climate cluster on the right side. The upper line depicts without recovery, and the bottom line depicts with recovery, because a lot of these landscapes are actually recovering, especially in the eastern portion of the range, but not so much as in the western portion. Now, when you look at that figure that was on the left, where those wildfires occur, especially the large fires, it relates really well to some classified annual grass that's been recently released. This is from the rangeland analysis platform. And we heard Steve Boyd talk about this yesterday, that most fires have annual grass invasion from his mapping as well. So this is just a depiction of that. So then the question becomes, okay, how much, when we burn these landscapes and we have net sagebrush loss, how much of this is occurring within sage-grouse habitat? And so what we see here is the depiction on the left of it occurring in sage-grouse habitat, and then we have annual loss and cumulative loss on the right. You can see there's quite a bit. Approximately 650,000 acres per year on average are being lost, and not a lot of it not replaced, because this is with recovery from wildfire and transitioning to cheatgrass. So what does this mean for sage-grouse? I'm going to get into population dynamics now. We could take that same model and start to fit covariates on the intrinsic growth rate. We fit lots of different covariates, not just wildfire, but we want to account for other confounding effects and look at interactions with things like precipitation. Bottom line here is we found that wildfire adversely affects sage-grouse in nearly all the climate clusters. Where you see that all that red lines, those are just samples from the posterior distribution. If they're going down, that means the effect is negative, meaning wildfire is having an impact. And you can see most of them are going down, and nearly all of those. The Great Basin, high confidence, low uncertainty in that effect, and it's a fairly strong effect, or very strong effect. Now, it gets a little more complex with precipitation, in that with low precipitation and high burned area, we see the worst circumstance for sage-grouse. This is kind of on average across the entire range, but this plane actually varies by each climate cluster. And I'm going to dive into one cluster that's perhaps the most important, and that's the Great Basin here, and talk about some research that we've published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. If we look at this plane here, you'll see that between cumulative burned area, which is the net sagebrush loss, and precipitation, most of those values in that within that plane are in the negative region. Wildfire has that much impact. Whereas if we just focus on no wildfire, I'm going to draw a line for you here, that yellow line on the plane, you can see that when we get above average precipitation, we actually have growth. That's the green region there. And below average precipitation, we have declines. That explains the oscillations through time in the La Nina, El Nino cycles. We get increases when precipitation happens, decreases when they don't, if there's no fire. Now, when we have fire, we actually have only small pulses of increase and large pulses of decrease. This gets back to the reduction in carrying capacity. So we still have the stochasticity associated with precipitation, but now the deterministic impact of wildfire on that is causing that population to decline. Now, that figure that you see on the right side isn't actual data. That's a cartoon depiction of what's happening here from actual data on the left side. But you can see some remarkable similarities between the figure on the right side and some of the figures that Kathy showed yesterday, especially the peripheral populations. They may not have wildfire per se, but the influence of habitat and other types of factors on the landscape is likely decreasing the carrying capacity, and these populations are still oscillating, just the oscillations are dampening in their trajectory, going down in trajectory. Now look at how close it fits to the Great Basin. This is the same figure through time about the oscillations through the Great Basin and how much they kind of mimic this conceptual model. When we get to this is a scary point. This is a complete burnover of a lek. And now we just have a plummeting population that no longer responds to precipitation. In other words, wildfire completely nullifies all influences of precipitation, and we just end up with extirpated leks. And we're seeing a lot of this in the Great Basin as well. We're in the process of analyzing that now, probability of activity, lek activity. So what does the future look like if we continue with this wildfire cheatgrass cycle unabated? Well, in about 30 years from now, we should according to these models, see about 50% reduction in sage-grouse populations overall, regardless of precipitation levels, even if we get more precipitation because of this interaction that I showed previously. And that's that last figure that you see there. So let's talk about the demographic, kind of the explanations, the mechanisms, the process behind that pattern. We used a before-after control impact study. This is kind of the gold standard where you have before data collected and then you have after data, and you have both of those at a control site as well. And we were fortuitous for the experimental design in this case that we were actually marking and following birds at these sites, and then a fire came in and we were able to collect information afterwards. It turned it into a fire design, but unfortunate for the sage-grouse. These fires occur at different times, and I'm just gonna, can you mind playing that video there? Thought I'd throw a video in here just because there's been a lot of figures. So you all know how we do this, but it's kind of fun to watch. We trap the birds, spotlighting at night. We put radio transmitters and GPS transmitters on them. This is a rump-mounted transmitter. This allows us to get many locations per day and excellent movement data from satellites. VHF is really good for vital rate information. We put this in a necklace style, and then we could use radio telemetry equipment to track the bird and pinpoint its location. And we do go right to the bird, kind of circle it, don't flush it, but know exactly where it's nesting, and then monitor its nest. Again, track it through the brood rearing period and count the number of chicks and so forth so that we can estimate these vital rates. And what we found in this research from these independent sites is a remarkable similarity in the posterior distributions and the effects themselves, but a 40 to 50% reduction in survival probabilities, adult survival with wildfire. We're seeing a lot more movement with our GPS information when it comes to fire. We're trying to understand how the grouse are using these landscapes so that we can rebuild habitat in a way that's conducive to their movement ecology. We also see some very similar amount of evidence. This is the amount of the distribution that's on the left side of that vertical line. That means that's the evidence that there's a decrease in survival, and 80 to 80.78% probability of decrease. So pretty strong relationship there, but where it's most alarming is in the nest phase. If you look at these posterior distributions, again, very similar in shape, but we actually see a much stronger reduction, 70 to 90% decline in a median value, and about 86% probability overall, which is consistent with the Holloway fire from Lee Foster's work. This gets back to a lot of what I talked about yesterday with ravens, and that when you lose that sagebrush cover, visually cued predators become much more efficient at finding these nests. And of course, we have some cameras in some of these areas where we could capture in the predator community. And here we know that ravens increases raven predation rates with a loss of cover, as I explained in a couple slides yesterday. To get at these effects more, there's some really interesting behaviors of grouse here and what happens when their landscapes are burned. These birds are not really flexible in their behavior. They're pretty well locked into patterns. So when you burn the landscape, they select herbaceous cover when they're typically selecting sagebrush because they're going back to these areas that have been burned. And so but these increased burned areas are reducing their survival. And what this also means is that nest survival decreases with the loss of sagebrush cover. And you can see the figures there that depict these three relationships that I'm pointing out. We have multiple studies here where we found this to be the case. And so this is basically a maladaptive behavior of these birds, of which the fire has created an ecological trap, which is a type of sink. And the birds move into those areas, and their basically environmental cues are misaligned with the population performance. So they select these areas, and in fact, it has negative impacts on their demographic rates. When you align these sinks, which are the red areas up there, because we map the high selection, low survival, with the fire scars, they overlap pretty substantially. So this just shows that we're creating essentially habitat sinks on the landscape. Fires are creating habitat sinks on the landscape. When we're looking at brood habitat or brood rearing, we see similar patterns. These figures are a little bit difficult sometimes to adjust, so I'm going to just point out one area to focus on. This is high annual grass selection and high burned area. The left figure is selection, the right figure is survival. This means that they're selecting areas that have burn and high annual grass, but yet they have low survival in those areas. Again, another maladaptive behavior from these birds. We're seeing it also in the late brood rearing period to some stage, although they're moving out of the burned areas, probably because they lack water sources and they're really starting to look for water during this time frame. Again, we can map these and develop these ecological sinks and know this really helps managers know where to go to put plant sagebrush, those types of things for refugia, just because grouse are using those areas to get help out with population performance. I'm going to talk about that in the last couple slides here. Before thinking about how to restore landscapes when fires burn, we need to think about the concepts of sage-grouse demography and population dynamics with restoration ecology. And it's really important because there is a misalignment here. And this cartoon, this graphic kind of demonstrates that. We could have a lot of birds in this population functioning within this habitat. And when a wildfire comes through and knocks that population down to a really low number, we have a problem here because birds, something called an inverse density dependence or an Ali effect, birds can't just go back up with the habitat to those original numbers. There's too few breeding individuals to allow for that because they have a certain maximum growth rate. And there's not enough years of precipitation per se to allow for that type of growth. So you end up with habitat, but with very, very few birds, if ever, recover. And because of that stochasticity I talked about earlier, they're very susceptible to extinction with just a climatic event. So this is problematic. So we need to think about that in terms of how much having these landscapes burn in the first place, what that actually means. So we did an analysis taking the concentration areas within the Great Basin and used our modeled parameter estimates and just focusing on those areas. If we reduce the net sagebrush loss within those areas by different amounts, where do we neutralize growth rate into the future? And you can see that the right figure depicts that, and we came up with this approximately 75% reduction in net sagebrush loss will stabilize that growth rate. You could do this through fire suppression, protection, restoration. All of these actions will help you reduce net sagebrush loss. So then the question is, which one's more important? Should we be focusing on suppression or should we be focusing on restoring these landscapes? So we've ran another analysis, a simulation, given the fire history data to see which one would actually amount to more benefits. And it's fairly simple. We could just take fires from the past and we can subset those fires out and suppress them and rerun net sagebrush loss. And then we can restore those under different management scenarios like seeding and planting. And we use information from the literature to guide that restoration process. And so this all goes into that model. And these are actually figures from Dave Pike's work that we worked with, Cam and I and others on a project called the Field of Sagebrush Dreams, but we also used a lot of data from the Sage Step project in general. And this red line here depicts where that 75% reduction in net loss is. And you can see the seeding and the planting scenarios do better than passive, but they're still pretty high up there. Matter of fact, we need 75% suppression to get below that line. So alternatively, that's a lot of fires to try to suppress through various types of activities I'll talk about in a moment here. You could target those just within the concentration areas. 25% of the fires that are burning annually, if we focus those in these concentration areas, then we will protect sage-grouse habitat. We'll allow sage-grouse to neutralize in their growth just by focusing efforts on those specific areas, which tend to be the most contiguous sagebrush environments as well. We could guide where these are the concentration areas here, and we could guide exactly where to go based on that R&R layer. Because we know with low R&R, we're likely not to recover that landscape if it burns. So that would be a higher priority for suppression. And you can see those areas depicted in the red there. We could also further use probability of burn surfaces because we know where the likelihood these are going to burn. So they might need the most amount of suppression. Like this area here, there's a few others in there that are light and purple there where it's those areas that I just talked about are now interacting with this probability burn surface. We published this information in this article down here as a science framework. And so some of the suppression activities include fuel breaks, and we're looking into the effectiveness and the effects of fuel breaks, how they are at passively stopping fires, and even actively, in that we could stage resources there. Firefighters can backburn from these areas faster. But there is some, we get about 60% or so success from fuel breaks, and there's some variation in low R&R conditions. Some of the treatments of fuel breaks, like ground stripping, do the best, and that's largely because you're completely removing the fuels in an otherwise dry environment. So that came out. We're looking at a whole bunch of other environmental factors. Now, we do have fires burn within these concentration areas, so we do need restoration practices that are effective. Matt Germino is going to give a great talk, because he always does, about, and I'm sure of it, about some of the practices and the insights that he's learned, I think specifically from the soda fire, but maybe other areas. But there's a lot to be learned from a lot of the work that's being done out there on how to improve restoration practices. We're developing some tools that incorporate a lot of that information into this planning environment, so we can spatially explicitly simulate management actions, whether it's seeding or planting, and see what the benefits to actual sage-grouse are. So it goes as far as restoring those landscapes, running suitability models, the demographic models, and measuring these benefits to sage-grouse populations. So it's linked to habitat suitability. And so an example of how this tool works, and we have an article published on this as well. These are a few fires from the bi-state, and it pulls these ones out as ranked the highest for in need of active restoration practices, and we can rank them by this grouse benefit index here. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but there's a publication out there in Ecological Applications about that tool. And here's some software we're developing for interface for managers. This analysis up here demonstrates exactly where to go within that fire, where you're going to have the most benefits from seeding or planting, and outputs, for example, recovered acres over 30 years, over 50 years, and so forth. I want to end this with a little bit of a positive note, because there is a lot in here that seems to be doom and gloom. And that is some actions that we've carried out in the bi-state. There's been about $45 million in actions that have been carried out in the bi-state, nearly 80 conservation projects. And we're monitoring the effectiveness of these using that same hierarchical framework and a Baki design, trying to understand lag effects on those actions and how it's influencing those populations of which the conservation action is being carried out, as opposed to the trend of the bi-state as a whole. And when we look at the results, they're very actually encouraging. You could see all these positive lines. These are Baki ratios, which are improvements in population growth rate for all of these actions that are being carried out in the bi-state. Sagebrush restoration is actually a very strong one in this case. We're seeing about 5 to 4.2%, 5 for seeding, 4.2% improvement in lambda value. That means that those populations that are actually declining are going into a stage of increasing when we carry out some of these restoration practices at the site scale. So with the funds, with the planning appropriately, we can reverse these trends. And the bi-state is not tracking the rest of the Great Basin. It has per capita the most amount of conservation actions. And this gets back to the beginning of the talk. These conservation actions help us increase that carrying capacity, which then allows those populations to go up. Now, if we're in this demographic low point, then we could use translocation and those types of methods, as long as the habitat's there and the carrying capacity is there to support sage-grouse. And with that, I know I'm out of time. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time today. Oh, I got to acknowledge all the folks here and the states for the data. Thank you very much. None of that would have been possible without the states. Appreciate it.